there! Ready for a wellness adventure? Let's explore the world of health together.
Have you ever wondered what the difference is between your brain, your mind, and your behavior? We often use these words interchangeably, but for psychologists and neuroscientists, they represent three distinct, yet deeply connected levels of who we are. Getting this right is the key to understanding everything from learning a new skill to managing your mental health. Let's start with the brain. The brain is the physical organ inside your skull. It's made of cells, blood vessels, and a complex cocktail of chemicals. It has weight, it has a specific structure, and you can see it on a scan. Scientists can study its electrical activity, track blood flow, and even examine its tissue under a microscope. When we talk about the brain, we're talking about a biological, tangible thing, the central command center of our nervous system that coordinates everything from our senses to our movements. Now, what about the mind? Unlike the brain, the mind isn't a physical object. You can't point to your mind on an MRI scan the way you can point to your hippocampus. The mind refers to our subjective, internal world. It's the realm of our thoughts, memories, emotions, intentions, and our very consciousness. When you feel a pang of anxiety, solve a tricky puzzle, or daydream about your next vacation, you're experiencing mental events. The mind is the functional level it describes what the brain is doing in terms of experience and processing information. Then there's behavior. This is the simplest one to grasp because it's everything we do that can be observed from the outside. Walking, talking, smiling, checking your phone, these are all behaviors. You don't need a brain scan or a deep conversation to see them. You can record behavior with a camera or time it with a stopwatch. Behavioral science focuses on these observable actions and how they change in response to our environment. Public health agencies, for example, rely heavily on behavioral data like whether people are taking their medication or getting enough sleep, because behavior has a direct impact on our well-being. So how do these three levels work together? They are in a constant, dynamic loop. Brain activity makes mental experiences possible. Those mental experiences influence our behavior. And our behavior, in turn, feeds back into the brain, shaping it through learning and experience. Think about learning to drive a car. At the brain level, neural circuits related to vision, motor control, and attention are firing and forming new connections. At the mind level, you're experiencing intense concentration, awareness of the traffic around you, and the memory of traffic rules. And at the behavior level, you're physically pressing the pedals, turning the steering wheel, and checking your mirrors. You can't fully explain the act of driving by looking at just one of these levels. Together, they give us the complete picture. A great analogy is computer hardware and software. The brain is like the hardware, the physical chips and circuits. The mind is like the software, the programs, calculations, and the user interface. Software can't run without hardware, but trying to describe a word processing program by talking about electrical currents wouldn't be very useful. In the same way, describing the feeling of joy purely in terms of neurotransmitters doesn't capture the richness of the experience itself. This distinction helps clear up some major misconceptions. For example, have you ever heard someone say, "It's all in your mind," as if to suggest something isn't real? That's just wrong. Mental experiences are incredibly real because they have real effects. The mental state of stress, for instance, can concretely change your heart rate, weaken your immune system, and disrupt your sleep. On the other hand, just because something is based in the brain doesn't mean it's permanent or unchangeable. Our brains are constantly reorganizing themselves based on our experiences. This amazing property is called neuroplasticity, which we'll dive into deeper later in this series. Learning, therapy, and even simple practice can physically change our brain circuits. Understanding behavior as a separate level is also crucial. We often assume that someone's actions are a perfect window into their thoughts and feelings, but that's not always true. A person might avoid a social gathering for many reasons. Are they anxious, exhausted, or just busy? The same behavior can stem from very different mental states. That's why just observing behavior isn't enough. It gives us clues, but not the whole story. The relationship is a continuous feedback loop. An event in your environment, like reading a scary news article, acts as sensory input to your brain. Your brain processes this, creating a mental experience, like fear or worry. This feeling then influences your behavior, and maybe you start checking the news compulsively. This behavior then changes your environment by exposing you to more scary news, which reinforces the entire cycle. So which level is the most real? The answer is all of them. Each one provides a valid and essential piece of the puzzle. Brain imaging is great for understanding diseases. Self-reports of thoughts and feelings are crucial for therapy. And behavioral observation is key for measuring real-world outcomes. Modern psychology and neuroscience thrive by integrating all three. This is especially true in mental health. Take depression, for example. At the brain level, there are measurable changes in neurotransmitter systems and activity in mood-related networks. At the mind level, a person experiences persistent negative thoughts, a loss of pleasure, and low motivation. And at the behavior level, they might withdraw from friends and have trouble sleeping. Effective treatment has to address all these levels, often using a combination of medication to affect brain chemistry, therapy to change thought patterns, and behavioral strategies to build healthier habits. This multi-level view also helps us think about personal responsibility. Recognizing that our brain and mind influence our behavior doesn't mean we have no control, but it does explain why changing habits can be so hard. A habit isn't just a choice you make in a vacuum. It's a pattern etched into your brain circuits and reinforced by your environment. This is why effective public health strategies often focus on changing systems and environments, not just on telling people to have more willpower. These levels are always in flux. When you practice a musical instrument, your brain's motor and auditory networks physically change. Mentally, the task begins to feel more automatic. Behaviorally, your fingers move more smoothly and accurately. It's a perfect illustration of how experience powerfully links the brain, mind, and behavior. In the past, science has swung between focusing too much on one level. Early behaviorists ignored the mind because it wasn't directly observable. Then the cognitive revolution brought the mind back, and advances in neuroscience finally allowed us to connect mental processes to the brain. Today, we know that we need all three to get a complete picture. So the next time you hear phrases like, it's all in your head, or my brain made me do it, remember the distinction. The brain is the hardware, the mind is the subjective experience, and behavior is the observable action. Understanding how they interact is the first step toward better understanding ourselves and others. Instead of asking if a problem is mental or physical, we can ask a better question: how our brain processes, mental experiences, and behaviors all interacting in this situation. This integrated view is not just theoretical. It's the foundation of modern science and the key to creating effective solutions for human well-being. Have you ever wondered how scientists go from a simple question like, does less sleep make me grumpy, to a full-blown scientific explanation? It's not magic, it's a careful, step-by-step process. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on how psychology and neuroscience build knowledge, piece by piece. It all starts with observation and clear definitions. Scientists can't just study something vague like stress. They need to define it in a way they can actually measure. This is called an operational definition. So instead of stress, a researcher might measure heart rate changes, levels of the stress hormone cortisol in your saliva, or scores on a specific, validated questionnaire. Without these clear definitions, two scientists could be talking about stress, but measuring completely different things, which would be like trying to build a house with two different sets of blueprints. Once we know what we're measuring, we need the right tools. In neuroscience, this might mean using an fMRI machine to see how blood flows in the brain, or an EEG to track electrical patterns. For the mind, measurement often involves structured tasks or standardized surveys that have been rigorously tested for reliability and validity. Reliability means you get similar results if you repeat the measurement. Validity means you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. It acts like a good scale. It should show the same weight every time you step on it. And it should measure your weight, not your height. Now, here's a big one you've probably heard of: correlation versus causation. This is a crucial distinction. Correlation simply means two things change together. For example, studies consistently show that as sleep duration goes down, reports of bad moods go up. That's a correlation. But does less sleep cause the bad mood? Not necessarily. Maybe a third factor, like high stress, is causing both poor sleep and a low mood. Or maybe being in a low mood makes it harder to sleep. Correlation shows a relationship, but it doesn't tell you the direction of the arrow. To figure out causation, scientists need to run experiments. In a true experiment, researchers actively manipulate one thing while trying to keep everything else the same. To test if sleep loss causes attention problems, they might assign one group of people to get a full 8 hours of sleep and another group to get only 4 hours, all in a controlled lab environment. Then they'd measure everyone's performance on an attention task. If the sleep-deprived group consistently does worse, we can be much more confident that the lack of sleep is causing the drop in attention. This is why random assignment and control groups are the gold standard for establishing cause and effect. But one single study, no matter how well designed, is never the final word. Science relies on replication. Other, independent researchers need to be able to run a similar experiment and get similar results. If they can't, the original finding might have been a fluke, a result of bias, or a mistake in the method. This is why transparency in science is so important. It allows others to check the work. Replication is how science self-corrects and builds a solid foundation of knowledge. All this evidence from observations, experiments, and replications is used to build a scientific theory. And let's be clear, a scientific theory isn't just a guess or hunch. It's a comprehensive, well-supported explanation for how something works, based on a mountain of accumulated evidence. For example, learning theory explains how we form associations, based on decades of research. A good theory also generates new, testable predictions. If those predictions consistently fail, the theory has to be revised or even thrown out. When building these explanations, scientists follow a principle called parsimony, or Occam's razor. It just means we should prefer the simplest explanation that fits all the evidence. If a friend does poorly on a test after staying up all night, the most parsimonious explanation is that sleep deprivation affected their memory. We don't need to invent a complex conspiracy theory about the professor. We stick to what's simplest and most supported. Of course, data doesn't speak for itself. Researchers use statistics to analyze their results. Statistics help us figure out if a difference between two groups is real or if it could have just happened by chance. If one group has a slightly faster reaction time than another, a statistical test can tell us the probability that this difference is just random noise. But it's also important to remember that statistical significance isn't the same as practical importance. A tiny difference might be statistically significant in a huge study, but it might not matter at all in the real world. It's also useful to think about different levels of explanation. We can explain anxiety from a psychological perspective, talking about negative thought patterns. We can also explain it from a neuroscientific perspective, talking about an overactive amygdala in the brain. These aren't competing explanations. They're complementary. One describes the what at the level of thought, and the other describes the how at the level of brain circuitry. Both can be true and useful at the same time. And we can't forget about individual differences. Not everyone reacts the same way. Caffeine makes many people alert, but your genetics and how much coffee you normally drink can change its effect. Scientists look for average patterns, but they also study this variability to understand why people respond differently. To see how things change over time, researchers use longitudinal studies. Instead of just a one-time snapshot, they follow the same people for months, years, or even decades. This helps us understand long-term trends, like how early childhood experiences might relate to health and happiness in adulthood. And when there are dozens or even hundreds of studies on a single topic, how do we make sense of it all? That's where a meta-analysis comes in. This is a study of studies, where researchers mathematically combine the results from many different experiments to get a more stable overall picture of the effect. Health organizations often rely on these when creating public guidelines. All of this work is done within strict ethical boundaries. Scientists can't just do anything to answer a question. They have a primary responsibility to protect their participants from harm. This is why some questions can only be studied using observational or correlational methods. It's also crucial to remember that scientific knowledge evolves. What we know today is built on what we learned yesterday, and it will be updated by what we learn tomorrow. Early ideas about the brain suggested it was fixed in adulthood. Now we have overwhelming evidence that our brains continue to change throughout our lives. This isn't a weakness of science. It's its greatest strength, the ability to adapt based on new evidence. This is why it's so important to be critical of media headlines that oversimplify a single preliminary study into a definitive fact. Real understanding doesn't come from one flashy finding. It comes from the slow, careful, and deliberate process of building evidence. Ultimately, scientific explanations in psychology and neuroscience are probabilistic, not absolute. They tell us about likelihoods and risks. Chronic stress increases the probability of developing an anxiety disorder, but it doesn't guarantee it. This systematic approach, from clear definitions and controlled experiments to replication and statistical analysis, is how we move beyond anecdotes and personal beliefs to build a reliable understanding of the human mind and brain. Have you ever wondered why psychology isn't just one single subject? Why are there so many different branches, like cognitive, developmental, and social psychology? It might seem confusing, but there's a really smart reason for it. Think of it like building a map. You wouldn't use a road map to understand the weather patterns, right? You need different maps for different things. Psychology and neuroscience work the same way. No single perspective can explain everything about our minds, brains, and behaviors, so researchers specialize. Each subfield tackles a specific set of questions, uses its own unique tools, and adds another layer to our understanding. It's not a bunch of disconnected ideas. It's a coordinated effort to create a complete picture of who we are. Let's start with cognitive psychology. This field is all about our mental machinery. It asks, how do we process information? Cognitive psychologists study things like attention, memory, language, and decision-making. Imagine you've misplaced your keys. A cognitive psychologist wouldn't just focus on how frustrated you feel. They do want to know exactly how your brain tried. To store the memory of where you put them and what's going wrong during the retrieval process. They use experiments to measure things like reaction time and accuracy to figure out how our thinking works, and sometimes how it fools us. Next up is developmental psychology. This field looks at how we change throughout our entire lives, from the moment we're born until old age. It's not just about how we grow, but also how we stay the same. Developmental researchers explore fascinating questions like how babies learn to talk, how teenagers develop self-control, and why our cognitive abilities might shift as we get older. Their work is incredibly important for things like education and public health. For example, they've shown that the part of a teenager's brain responsible for seeking rewards develops faster than the part that controls impulses. This helps explain why teens might take more risks, and it's not because they're just being irresponsible. It's a normal part of brain development. Then there's social psychology, which is all about us in relation to others. It examines how we're influenced by the people around us. Think about conformity, group behavior, prejudice, and even love. Social psychologists ask how the situation we're in shapes our actions. For example, would you be more likely to donate to a cause if you were alone or in a big group? The answer might surprise you. Research shows that our behavior can change dramatically depending on who's watching or what we think others expect of us. This field proves that our personality isn't the only thing driving our actions. The social world has a powerful pull. Now, let's talk about clinical psychology. This is the branch most people think of when they hear the word psychology. It's focused on understanding, diagnosing, and treating mental health conditions. Clinical psychologists take what we know from all the other fields, cognitive, developmental, and even neuroscience, to help people who are struggling. They don't just put a label on symptoms. They dig deeper to understand the mechanisms behind them, like how avoiding scary situations can actually make anxiety worse, or how dwelling on negative thoughts can keep depression going. It's the field that directly bridges scientific research with helping people in need. What about the brain itself? That's where neuroscience comes in. Neuroscience is the biological foundation of it all. It studies the brain's hardware, the neurons, the circuits, and the chemicals that make everything happen. Using tools like brain imaging, neuroscientists can watch the brain in action. When you feel scared, they can see which parts of your brain are lighting up to detect a threat and get your body ready to react. But neuroscience doesn't replace psychology. Instead, it provides the how. It explains the biological machinery that runs the mental processes psychology describes. Let's not forget behavioral psychology. This field zeroes in on what it can see and measure, our observable actions. Behavioral psychologists study how we learn. They look at how consequences, like rewards and punishments, shape what we do, and how cues in our environment can trigger habits. Instead of trying to figure out what someone is thinking, they measure how often, how long, or how intensely a person performs a certain action. These principles are used everywhere, from helping kids learn in classrooms to helping adults break bad habits. The focus is always on creating measurable, real-world change. And what about the connection between our minds and our bodies? That's the domain of health psychology. This field explores how our behaviors and mental states impact our physical health. Things like our sleep habits, how we manage stress, and whether we stick to our doctor's advice are all part of it. Health psychologists help design programs to prevent illness and promote wellness. For instance, when creating a campaign to encourage vaccination, they don't just focus on the science of the vaccine. They also consider how people perceive risk and what kind of messaging will be most persuasive. Then we have personality psychology. While a social psychologist might ask why you felt anxious in a specific situation yesterday, a personality psychologist asks why some people are just more prone to anxiety in general. They study the stable long-term patterns in how we think, feel, and behave. They use models like the Big 5 personality traits to understand things like why we choose certain careers, how we act in relationships, and our typical ways of coping with stress. Close to this is educational psychology, which is all about how we learn in places like schools. It looks at the best ways to teach, how to give effective feedback, and what motivates students to succeed. Educational researchers work with schools to design better curricula and test. For example, they've proven that spacing out your study sessions over time is far more effective for long-term memory than cramming everything in the night before an exam. There's also neuropsychology, a fascinating blend of neuroscience and clinical psychology. It studies how brain injuries or neurological conditions affect our thinking and behavior. After a stroke or a head injury, a neuropsychologist can use specific tests to identify which cognitive abilities have been impacted. This helps create a targeted rehabilitation plan, showing a clear link between what's happening in the brain and how we function in our daily lives. What about our distant past? Evolutionary psychology looks at how our behaviors today might be influenced by what helped our ancestors survive and reproduce thousands of years ago. It explores why we might be wired to quickly spot threats or why social bonding is so important to us. It's a field that generates intriguing hypotheses about the deep roots of human nature. And we can't ignore the world around us. Cultural psychology studies how our culture shapes everything from our emotions to our sense of self. It shows that behaviors considered normal in one society might be seen very differently in another. This is crucial for understanding mental health across the globe and helps us avoid making the mistake of thinking that one group's experience is universal. Finally, there's industrial and organizational psychology, or IO psychology. This field applies psychological principles to the workplace. It tackles issues like employee motivation, leadership, team dynamics, and job satisfaction. Companies use IO psychology to improve safety, reduce burnout, and help everyone be more effective and happier at work. So you see, all these fields are asking different, but connected, questions. Cognitive psychology asks how memory works. Neuroscience asks which brain circuits support it. Developmental psychology asks how our memory changes with age. Clinical psychology asks how memory biases can lead to depression. They aren't competing for the one right answer. They're all adding a piece to the same giant puzzle. This is why interdisciplinary collaboration is so important. Tackling a complex problem like addiction requires all hands on deck. You need neuroscience to understand the brain's reward system, behavioral psychology to change habits, clinical psychology to provide therapy, and social psychology to address peer pressure. No single field has the whole solution. By dividing the vast study of the mind and brain into these specialized areas, science can be much more precise and effective. Researchers can focus their efforts and make real progress. So the next time you hear about a new discovery in psychology, Think about which piece of the map it's filling in. Together, these fields are creating an incredibly detailed and integrated picture of what it means to be human.
Thanks for watching.
If you found this helpful, don't forget to subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more insights into the amazing world of psychology. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. Hope you liked it.